Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 206 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Between 1500 and the 1860s, Europeans and Americans forcibly removed approximately 12 million African people from the African continent, transported them to the Americas, and enslaved them. But why did Europeans and Americans enslave Africans? How did they justify their actions? That's what we're going to explore today as we take a look at some of the origins of the rules governing the practice of slavery in the early modern Atlantic world. Specifically, we're going to explore how Christianity influenced early ideas about slavery and its practice. Our guide for this exploration is Katharine Gerbner, an assistant professor of history at the University of Minnesota and the author of Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World. Now, as we dive into this very long and complicated history between slavery and Christianity, Katharine reveals the evolution of the relationship between Christianity and slavery in Europe, how ideas about Protestant Christianity and slavery developed in the North American and Caribbean colonies, and the idea of Protestant supremacy, and how it influenced and gave way to the idea of race-based slavery. But first, it's almost here. The new Doing History series on biography. In just a few weeks, the Omohundro Institute and I will begin releasing our new Doing History series, and it's going to be fantastic. This 4-episode series will allow us to explore what makes biography a biography, how historians and biographers write biographies, and details from 3 biographies that will allow us to explore the genre up close through specific examples. Plus, my digital projects team members Joseph Edelman and Holly White are also working on some great blog posts and resources to complement these episodes. So you should be sure you've downloaded the free OI Reader app so you don't miss them. You can download the app from your favorite app store or by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader. Okay, ready to venture into the early modern world of Christianity and slavery? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an assistant professor of history at the University of Minnesota. She teaches courses on Atlantic history, the history of religion, and magic and medicine. She's an expert on the religious dimensions of race, authority, and freedom in early America, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic world. And today, she joins us to discuss her first book, Christian Slavery, Conversions and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Katharine Gerbner.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Now, Katharine's book, Christian Slavery, reveals how debates between slaveholders, Black Christians, and missionaries transformed the practice of Protestantism and the language of race in the early modern Atlantic world. Katharine, those are really important topics, and before we dive into discussions between slaveholders, Black Christians, and missionaries, it seems like it would be really helpful for us to know what the relationship between Christianity and slavery was prior to the 17th century. So, would you provide us with a bit of an overview of that relationship?
Yes, absolutely. So Christianity and slavery have a very long and complicated history. So slavery is referenced in the Bible, and early Christians sometimes actually preached that enslavement could be spiritually advantageous. Early Christian societies, like most human societies, also had slavery. So initially, it was even uncontroversial for a Christian to own another Christian. And the Roman Church itself actually owns some Christian slaves. But what happens over time is that the rules governing slavery in Christian Europe start to change. So by the early medieval period, for example, slavery was still widely accepted by Christians, but it became increasingly taboo for a Christian to own another Christian, or to sell a slave to a non-Christian. And the practice of slavery also differed greatly based on region. So this is sort of a broad generalization, but in Northwestern Europe, what happens is that chattel slavery becomes less common, even though other forms of unfreeness persist. Whereas in southwestern Europe, chattel slavery remains prevalent, and there the laws governing slavery continue to change. And this is particularly in response to the growing power of Islamic nations. So in these areas, enslavement of Muslims becomes far more common, while it was increasingly unacceptable for Christians to keep other Christians as slaves. So by the beginning of the 17th century, though, overall, you could say that the vast majority of Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, and regardless of region, would have agreed that Christians should not enslave other Christians, but that the enslavement of non-Christians was justified or could be justified in particular cases, such as just war, for example.
You know, when we think of slavery today, many of us tend to think of black chattel slavery, which was the most common form of slavery practiced in North America and the Caribbean. And this was the practice of slavery where, at least generally, white people enslaved African and African Americans and treated them as property instead of people. But black chattel slavery does not seem to be the type of slavery that was practiced in medieval or southwestern Europe. So I wonder if you would tell us a bit more about slavery as it was practiced in Europe between the medieval period and the 17th century. If European Christians couldn't enslave other Christians, who were they enslaving?
Right. So this was part of the Reconquista, or it was part of a crusade. They were often enslaving Muslims, although there are examples of sort of Orthodox Christians also sometimes being enslaved, though this was sort of officially illegal in most places. And so what you see is that really the practice of enslavement becomes increasingly bound up with the ideas of the Crusades and the Reconquista in this period.
So with the Reconquista, we're talking about the Christian crusade to retake Muslim-controlled territory in Iberia and to unify the Christian kingdoms there. So in this case, it sounds like Europeans were using warfare and religion to justify slavery and specifically the enslavement of Muslims. And I wonder, did other Christian European areas also practice this form of slavery? I mean, did they practice this form of slavery in Catholic France?
No. Sort of in parts of France and parts of northwestern Europe, unfreeness persists, as I was saying, but sort of chattel slavery is its practice in sort of the southern Mediterranean. It's not as prevalent in other parts of Europe as it is in the Iberian Peninsula. And so the ideas about slavery and Christianity sort of are different farther away from the Mediterranean, although it's important to say that this doesn't mean that these areas were free regions, right? There were some cities in sort of Germany and France and England that like to call themselves sort of free soil cities or free air cities, and they like to conceive of themselves as not having any slaves. But this wasn't actually the case. Slavery was still sort of existent in other parts of Europe, but it just was a sort of a difference of degree.
Now, what about the expansion of the slave trade? There's a whole body of literature that talks about how the European desire for slaves crossed into Africa with the expansion of Christianity. So would you tell us how both Christianity and the slave trade expanded in Africa?
So in the 15th century, Portuguese merchants sort of begin to sail farther down the coast of Africa. And they're mostly looking for gold, but they soon begin to trade for slaves as well. And so the trade in sub-Saharan slaves, many of whom were not Muslim, this sort of created new questions about the relationship between Christianity and slavery. Because, as I was sort of saying before, enslavement had been justified in part as part of the Reconquista, as a crusade with Islam. So if these men and women were not Muslim, then how could enslavement be justified? So individual merchants didn't really care very much about the specifics, but the Pope and other church officials did. And so in 1452, the Pope actually issued a papal bull that basically stated that the Portuguese had full and free permission to, quote, invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and reduce them into perpetual servitude. So in other words, what happens is that slave trading in sub-Saharan Africa can sort of be considered as part of a crusade, and so expands the justification for slavery into sort of West Africa and West Central Africa.
Now, although the relationship between Christianity and slavery began with the Catholic Church, Katharine's book, Christian Slavery, details how that relationship took hold and evolved in Protestant Christianity as well. Katharine, would you tell us about Protestantism's relationship with slavery and its ideas about it?
I mean, again, this is a really big topic, but basically in the 16th century, just as Portugal and Spain were expanding the African slave trade, the Protestant Reformation was spreading across much of Northern and Northwestern Europe. So it's hard to sum up the Protestant Reformation in a few sentences, but I will say that most Protestants could agree that Christians should be able to, for example, read the Word of God in their own languages. They would have agreed that the Catholic Church had lost its way, but they also sort of disagreed both among themselves and with Catholics about the proper time for baptism, the meaning of true conversion, and things like the theological significance of the Lord's Supper or communion. But aside from sort of theological differences, I think another thing we have to remember about the Protestant Reformation is how much it changed the bureaucratic structure of the church. So by the early 17th century, much of Northern and Western Europe was governed by Protestant rulers who had broken with the Pope. But at the same time, there was continued infighting between Protestants, which meant that most Protestant churches were pretty decentralized and frankly, pretty weak. The Church of England is a pretty good example of this. In the 16th century, Henry VIII, who was the King of England at the time, had declared a top-down reformation and said that he was now the head of the Church of England. But over the next century, what happened is that English people continued to fight over whether the church had been truly reformed, and this culminated in the English Civil War in the 1640s. And what this meant is that the Church of England was actually disestablished in the mid-17th century, just as the English were colonizing parts of North America and the Caribbean. And this would have a major effect on sort of the transplantation of the Church of England in the Americas. And then the other thing to remember about a side effect of the Reformation is that the Protestant churches didn't have large missionary bodies like the Dominicans or the Jesuits, for example. And these were the organizations that often handled missions to Native Americans or Africans in the Catholic colonies. And so they just didn't exist for Protestant denominations in the early colonial period. And it took a while for Protestants to form strong, well-funded missionary organizations. So this was another important aspect of Protestantism in this period. So you see, there were really important differences between Protestants and Catholics, but these were not just about church doctrine, but they were also about church governance and authority, and also about bureaucracy. I mean, it sounds boring, but it's so important. And all of these differences had important repercussions for the history of slavery and Christianity in the Americas.
Yeah, speaking of repercussions, what were the repercussions of these doctrinal and organizational differences between Catholics and Protestants for slavery? I mean, how did European Christian views about slavery change with the rise of Protestantism? And did Protestants also believe, like Catholics, that slavery could be advantageous for certain kinds of people and that you shouldn't enslave your own fellow Christians?
European views about slavery, well, they change greatly based on sort of circumstance. But what you see happening in especially Protestant regions of Europe is that they begin to think of themselves as uniquely free. And I was sort of mentioning this before, sort of this idea of free air or free soil. And it did not mean that these Protestants thought slavery was illegal in all respects. They were not anti-slavery Protestants, but instead they thought of themselves as uniquely free, partly because they were Protestants. And so you get this sort of idea, this association between Protestantism and freedom that also sort of ends up having a major effect on the relationship between slavery and Protestantism as it develops in the Americas once Protestants have actually founded their own colonies in North and Central America or the Caribbean.
You know, I find comparing colonies to be a really illuminating practice because there was just so much variation between them. And speaking of highlighting variation, in your book, Christian Slavery, you explored several different empires and the colonies they established in North America and the Caribbean. And I wonder if you would tell us about some of the differences you saw between the colonies established by Catholic empires like Spain, Portugal, and France, and the Protestant empires of England, the Netherlands, and Denmark.
There are a lot of differences. And, I don't want to make too broad a generalization, sort of comparing Catholic regions and Protestant regions. But at the same time, there are some critical differences that I think require explanation. And so what you see is that in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, as Spain and Portugal began to colonize parts of the Americas, they needed justification for what they were doing. And so what happens in that period is that the Pope and the Iberian monarchs issue legal codes that are intended to regulate the relationship between Catholicism and slavery. And I should emphasize here that just because, a law existed did not mean that it was followed. But in general, slave owners in these Catholic regions were supposed to baptize all enslaved people and to provide some religious instruction. I should also say that this was not simply altruistic. The Iberian monarchs saw Catholic baptism as a way to control the enslaved population and also to check the power of colonists. But Catholic baptism, in this case, did also offer enslaved people some important opportunities. Since they were recognized as Catholic, some enslaved people were able to use, for example, legal avenues to advocate for themselves and their families. And again, this wasn't always the case, but it was an important possibility. And in the English, Danish, and Dutch colonies, by contrast, now again, these are founded quite a bit after the Portuguese and Spanish colonies. But what you see is that the relationship between slavery and Protestantism develops quite differently. So, as I mentioned earlier, and this is sort of the basic tenet of Protestantism, there is no pope, right? There's no centralized authority to sort of determine things like what should be the relationship between Protestantism and slavery. So as a result of this, and also sort of a result of the decentralized, weak bureaucratic structures of the Protestant churches, the decision about when or if to baptize an enslaved person actually gets left in the hands of slave owners. And what I saw is that most Protestant slave owners did not want their slaves to convert to Christianity. They thought of Protestantism as a religion for free people. So this ties into what I was saying before about how sort of these ideas of Protestantism and freedom were often connected in people's minds. And so they worried that a baptized slave would demand freedom or rebel. So as a result of this fear, most Protestant slave owners, and especially in sort of colonies where there was a majority slave population, slave owners excluded enslaved people from Protestant churches. So again, this wasn't always the case. You can definitely find exceptions, especially in regions where there was a small enslaved population. But this was very much the case in places like Barbados or South Carolina, where there was a very large enslaved population and the slave owners were very fearful of slave rebellion.
Just before we get into the specifics of some of these Protestant colonies and how Christianity informed their practice of slavery, it seems interesting that you have a law in the books in Catholic colonies, which you said is not always followed, but a law in the books directing Catholics to baptize their slaves and to convert them to Christianity because this helped them justify their colonization and enslavement of others. Whereas this Protestant view of Christianity was that Christianity was a form of freedom. And because Protestants viewed Christians as free, they weren't interested really in baptizing their slaves and making them Christians. So with this in mind, I wonder if you saw, at least in the broad scope of your research, whether these outlooks of Christianity had any impact on the practice and brutality of slavery as practiced in Catholic colonies versus Protestant colonies.
Well, I do think that there are differences in, for example, right, like the legal avenues that enslaved people could take to advocate for themselves. Again, this was not always the case, but especially in urban centers in Catholic regions, places like Mexico City, there are examples of enslaved people suing in order to stay in the same city as their spouse. Because if you were a Catholic and married in the Catholic Church, then your marriage was considered to be a sacrament. So enslaved people had sort of a method to advocate for not being separated. If you're not recognized as a Protestant, let alone, any form of Christian, then this becomes a non-existent avenue within Protestant regions. And so I do think that it affects the way that enslaved people sort of recognized their opportunities within very broadly Protestant regions as opposed to Catholic regions. But again, there are some exceptional cases. There's one case in Virginia where an enslaved woman gains her freedom in part because of her previous baptism. So there are exceptions in both cases, but I do think that there is a general trend of difference in terms of how enslaved people were able to really advocate for themselves within slavery.
Okay, thus far, our conversation has been speaking in really broad terms. But I think now that we have a broad context in place for Christian views on slavery, we should really dive into some of the specific debates Black Christians, missionaries, and slave owners had about Christianity, slavery, and race. Katharine, you mentioned earlier that one of the places you studied in Christian slavery was the English colony of Barbados. What makes Barbados a great place for us to explore these debates over Christian conversion and slavery?
Yes, so Barbados was an extremely important colony in the 17th century. It's one of the first English colonies to be founded. It was the first to shift to sugar cultivation, and it was also the first to have a majority Black population. So as a result, it's also one of the first colonies that's creating new norms relating to Protestantism, slavery, and eventually race. So what I did in my research was I read through all the law books and all the baptismal records from the 17th and early 18th century Barbados. And I did so in order to try to understand not only how English colonists justified and legalized slavery, but also what role Christianity was playing in that process. Historically, many scholars have sort of argued that religion was not a very important part of especially Caribbean slave societies, that slave owners were irreligious. But I didn't find that to be the case. And what I found is that Christianity played a really central role in legalizing and justifying slavery in the English plantation colonies, really starting with Barbados.
Wow, that seems like a really big find. You know, you told us that you were using the law books and baptismal records, but what other historical records were you using that other scholars seem to have missed this point?
The pairing of legal records with baptismal records was really powerful. But I also was looking at all types of travel records and also missionary records from the Quakers, from the Anglicans. I mean, I basically tried to read everything I could get my hands on in order to understand the way that people were talking about religion and slavery, but also what they were actually doing, you know, in the baptismal records and what they were trying to legislate in the law books.
Now, Barbados was an English colony and the Anglican Church was the Church of England. So was Barbados a colony where the Anglican Church took hold? And if it was, what influence did the Anglican Church have on Barbadian Christianity and society?
Yes, the Anglican Church was the established church in Barbados. And this meant that, you know, Barbados was divided into Anglican parishes, and there were Anglican ministers who were supposed to be resident at each parish. And what I found is that they had a lot of trouble sort of getting ministers to come and stay in Barbados. It was not a great place to be, but that slave owners themselves really thought of themselves as Anglicans, and it was a very important part of their identity, even if they didn't live in a way that we would consider to be particularly religious. But they certainly found it was important to baptize their children and, you know, get married in the church and have a minister come and speak with them at certain critical moments in their lives. And so what you see is that Anglicanism sort of plays this important role, even though the ministers who are supposed to be talking to the white and Black residents of the colony do not have very much power and are in effect sort of in the hands of the slave owners. You know, if you look at the way that the church governance worked, there was no Episcopal bishop who was resident in the Caribbean or anywhere in the Americas. And as a result, you know, the ministers were really at the mercy of slave owners who formed the vestry that governed the church. So what you see is that the Church of England is important, but it's not powerful. Instead, it really becomes what one historian has called the planter's church. It becomes sort of another arm of the colonial government.
So if the planters had more power than the Anglican Church, in what ways did planters shape the Anglican Church and its views on slavery?
most Protestant slave owners didn't want enslaved people to convert to Christianity, right? So they think of Christianity as a religion for free people, as a religion for themselves. And they worried that a baptized slave would demand freedom or rebel against slavery. So what I saw in my research that even as sort of Anglicanism and the church are important on the islands, slave owners often excluded enslaved people from those Protestant churches. And I call this ideology Protestant supremacy. And I coined that term because I thought it was really important to name the way I saw religion functioning in early colonial slavery. So in this period, 17th century Barbados, the concept of racial whiteness had not yet developed. So there's no white supremacy. And instead, what I saw is that slave owners really were using religious difference in order to govern and police the free Black population. And so in the book, I argue that Protestant supremacy is actually the forerunner of white supremacy, but that these ideologies are linked. And so just to give you an example of how I was finding this, when I read through all of the law books from Barbados, what I found is that in the 17th century, colonists didn't call themselves white. Instead, they called themselves Christians. And it took several decades for slave-owning legislators to actually introduce the language of whiteness into law books. And before they had done so, the word Christian was really used as sort of a synonym for non-slave. And this was another reason that slave owners did not want enslaved people to become Christian. And this was sort of the complex of Protestant supremacy, which I argue was sort of an integral part of the early Protestant slave societies.
That's also an interesting finding, and also a somewhat confusing one in that today we often link the practice of slavery with race. But your findings really do reveal that, at least at the beginning, the practice of slavery had religious overtones, and that if you weren't a Christian, then you could be enslaved. And if you were a Christian, then you were supposed to be free and therefore have a sense of superiority. Now, when in English colonial history do you see the turn from slavery and freedom being defined as whether or not one was a Christian to being determined by one's race? I mean, when do you see the English start to use race to justify their practice of slavery?
Well, it happens gradually over the last decades of the 17th century. And, it happens sort of in different ways in different colonies. But I think it's really important to sort of do a close reading of exactly when and why, this word white and the ideology of whiteness and white supremacy, why it comes to be. So what I saw in Barbados is that it actually develops in the last decade of the 17th century. This is when the word white, in some cases, is literally used as a replacement for the word Christian in some of the laws. And there's a really interesting example in 1697, where the legislators in Barbados passed a new law that basically changed the prerequisites for voting on the islands. So previously, the prerequisites had been, you had to be a man, be a Christian, have property, and be 21, and whiteness was never mentioned. The 1697 law added the word white to the voting prerequisites for the first time. And so part of what I did in my research was I asked why 1697? What was happening in that year or in that sort of decade that would have incited the slave owners to want to add this word white to their prerequisites for voting? So what I found is that by comparing the law books to the baptismal records, what I saw is that despite sort of the general reluctance to allow enslaved people to convert to Protestantism, a very small number of Black men and women had actually been able to gain access to Protestant baptism. And an even smaller number of these men and women had managed to gain their freedoms from slavery, and some of them had even started to own some property. So in other words, it's at this very moment where these free Black Christians should have started to been recognized as freeholders who could vote and hold office. And it's at this moment that slave-owning lawmakers choose to introduce the word white into their law books. And so I argue that in the case of colonial Barbados, the emergence of whiteness and sort of the replacement of Protestant supremacy with white supremacy has a great deal to do with the emergence of a free Black Christian population. And I think what this shows is that it's really important to not only sort of see the broad patterns that, the idea of racial whiteness is emerging as a new justification for slavery, but also to look at the very specific local conditions that created the impetus for slave owners to actually put the word white into their law books. This wasn't an unthinking decision. It was a really intentional decision on the part of slave owners in order to defend their property, basically.
I wonder about the influence of the Barbadians' idea of Protestant supremacy, because back in episode 173, we spoke with Marisa Fuentes, and she noted that Barbados really set the tone for how other English and British colonists viewed slaves and practiced slavery. So, did any of the other English or British colonies adopt this Barbadian idea of Protestant supremacy?
I think that's absolutely correct. Because it's one of the first colonies to develop a large slave population, it's also one of the first to pass major legislation governing slavery. And so, several historians have looked at how, the laws passed in Barbados are then actually copied by other English colonies with sometimes only very small alterations. And so similarly, I do think that the ideas that come out of Barbados travel, the ideology of Protestant supremacy, I do think it set an important precedent. And we can see people moving from Barbados to, North America, bringing these ideas about Protestant supremacy with them. This is especially the case in South Carolina, where many of the early founders were actually former Barbados residents. And I think that it's also true in sort of the shift toward a racialized slave system and sort of the creation of whiteness. Again, sort of as we've mentioned, these ideas aren't only coming from Barbados. So, Virginia plays a really important role in this story also. But I do think that Barbados is a key region for understanding these processes of racialization and sort of the working out of the relationship between Christianity and slavery.
Well, since you brought it up, what about the role of Virginia? What sorts of ideas and precedents for slavery did you find coming out of that colony?
Virginia plays a really important role, and there's been a huge amount of attention placed on the history of Virginia for good reason. And partly because of that, I don't spend as much time talking about it in my book. But I would say you can also see a version of Protestant supremacy developing in Virginia, in that when Virginia is first founded in the early 17th century, there's a lot of talk about evangelization, both to Native Americans and then later to Africans, but there's actually not a lot of movement on that front. You could say that they don't really put their money where their mouth is. And over time, and especially as there are a few cases of enslaved people sort of using baptism in order to advocate for their freedom. So over time, what you see is Anglo-Virginians begin to make it increasingly difficult for enslaved people and indigenous people to become Christian. And so there is a similar sort of shift towards what I call Protestant supremacy in Virginia. And Virginia, the story of the emergence of whiteness is a little bit different than it is in Barbados, but it has some of the same contours in that slave-owning legislators are trying to work out how to justify and legalize slavery. And the last several decades of the 17th century are really sort of a testing ground for how to create laws that would protect the slave owners from losing their human property. So there are many sort of important laws that are passed in Virginia that also sort of have an influence throughout the English Atlantic world.
Okay, so to this point, we've discussed the practice of slavery, ideas and laws concerning who could be enslaved. And after we take a brief moment to talk about our episode's sponsor, we're going to turn our discussion to missionaries. Today, we're able to explore many of the nuances of Christian slavery because Katharine made use of a lot of different records. And when you check the notes in her book, Christian Slavery, you'll see that she didn't just use English sources. She read German and Dutch sources too. Knowing a foreign language really helps historians do their work, and it can help anyone better understand history and culture. Plus, learning a new language is just plain fun. Now, one of the ways you can learn a new language is with Babbel, the #1 selling language learning app in the world. Babbel's 10 to 15-minute lessons are available anytime, anywhere, on your desktop, smartphone, or tablet, and your progress is saved and synced across all your devices so that you can pick up right where you left off. Each lesson is crafted by language experts and voiced by native speakers. And this is important because this kind of ear training gets you ready for real-life situations. And right now, you can try Babbel for free. Go to Babbel.com or download the app from your favorite app store to try it for free. That's Babbel, Babbel.com, or download the app and try it for free. Babbel.com. Okay, now we should turn our conversation to missionaries. In Christian slavery, Katharine explores the work of three missionary groups: the Quakers, the Anglicans, and the Moravians. So why don't we start with the Quakers? In October 1671, George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, visited Barbados. And after his visit, he expressed real concerns about Quakerism and slavery in a sermon that he published entitled Gospel Family Order, being a short discourse concerning the ordering of families both of whites, blacks, and Indians. Katharine, would you tell us about Fox's visit to Barbados and about this sermon that came out of that visit?
Yes, so the Quakers play a really surprising role in this story about Christianity and slavery. Most people know about the Quakers really only as abolitionists. And they were, of course, absolutely essential players in the later abolitionist movements. But what most people don't realize is that in the 17th century, many Quakers actually owned slaves. George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, was not a slave owner. But as you mentioned, in 1671, he did travel to Barbados to visit the Quaker community there. And what he found is that nearly all Quakers living there at the time owned slaves. Fox found this entire situation to be very problematic, but not necessarily for the reasons that we might assume, given the later Quaker abolitionist movements. So this sermon that you mentioned, Gospel Family Order, didn't advocate for an end to slavery. Instead, Fox really sought to reform slavery, and he urged Quakers to convert, or in Quaker language, convince the enslaved members of their households to become Christian. Most historians have tried to call Fox's sermon and his sort of stance on slavery proto-abolitionist. But what I argue in my book is that I think it's better understood as an effort to Christianize slavery. And I should add that this was a radical stance at the time in that it undermines the ideology of Protestant supremacy, which of course excluded enslaved people from Christian communities. But I don't think that we can call it anti-slavery. And so what I sort of argue is that Fox and the Quakers, I think, have multiple legacies. So the one that's already been recognized for a long time is their legacy in anti-slavery and abolition. But I also think that there is another legacy which hasn't been acknowledged, which is in this effort to Christianize and reform slavery. So I think it's also important to see that Fox's thoughts on Christianizing slavery didn't just influence other Quakers. They were actually read by people of other Protestant denominations. And so, for example, the Anglican minister Morgan Godwin actually cited Fox in his own writings about slavery and urged his readers to follow the Quakers in their effort to convert enslaved people to Christianity. And so this is a very different story about Quakers and slavery than the one that is usually told.
That is a very different story than the one we usually hear about Quakers. Were there any other ways that Fox wanted to reform slavery by Christianizing it?
Right. Well, so definitely part of the solution for him was convincing enslaved people to become Quakers and to join English Quakers in their worship meetings. So that was a component of it. But, a lot of his writing was also about family order, as the title of the sermon suggests. And he was concerned about familial and sexual practices of enslaved people, and he wanted Quaker slave owners to do more to reform the behavior of enslaved people. So there was also this very strong sort of behavioral element of his vision of a Christianized slave system. And yeah, it's a surprising turn when we think about the later Quaker abolitionist movement.
So the Quakers wanted to Christianize slavery and reform some of the ways that slaveholders were practicing slavery. What about the Anglicans and their work through the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel? What did the Anglicans think about slavery and its relationship with Christianity?
So Anglican missionaries, like Quakers actually, found that Protestant slave owners were very resistant to the idea of slave conversion. And this was the case not only in Barbados, but also in places like New York and South Carolina. So in those places, we see Anglican missionaries like Francis Lejeune, for example, who was stationed first in the Caribbean and then later in South Carolina. He first had to convince slave owners that conversion would be beneficial. And in doing so, what I found is that these missionaries actually sort of ended up creating a really powerful argument for what I call Christian slavery, right? This vision of a Christianized slave system. They argued that Christian slaves would be more obedient, more trustworthy than non-Christian slaves. And Anglican missionaries also lobbied to pass legislation that would affirm that race instead of religious difference was the primary justification for enslavement. So in New York, for example, the Anglican missionary Elias Noe helped to pass a law that encouraged the baptism of enslaved people, but the law also affirms that slavery was heritable and race-based. So what you see here is that the effort to promote slave conversion by missionaries was really intimately tied up with the effort to create race-based laws that govern slavery.
So the Quakers and Anglicans both wanted to Christianize slavery in ways that kept the institution intact, and now we should really discuss the Moravians. In order to bring us a different Protestant perspective on slavery, Katharine explored the Moravians' work on the Danish colony of St. Thomas. Katharine, yours is the first book I've ever read that's offered a comparative example from the Danish Empire. So would you tell us about the Moravians, their views on the relationship between Christianity and slavery, and why you ventured into an exploration of slavery as practiced by a Danish colony? I mean, what does this particular comparison reveal that's so valuable?
Yes, so the Moravians, just to sort of give a little bit of background, they're a small Protestant denomination headquartered in Eastern Germany. So they're a pretty small group, but they actually play a really critical role in the development of Black Protestantism in the Atlantic world. So they were really the most successful Protestant denomination in terms of attracting enslaved and free Black converts into their congregations in the early colonial period. And they also form a really important bridge between the early missionary efforts of the Quakers and Anglicans that I've talked about, and then later missionary movements of Methodists and Baptists sort of associated with the Great Awakening. And I really can't emphasize enough how important I think it is to really look beyond linguistic and imperial borders in order to include the Moravians in this story about Christianity and slavery. So the first Moravian mission was founded in 1732, and it was to enslave people in the island of St. Thomas, which was part of the Danish West Indies. But, Moravian missionaries were constantly traveling between not just the British and Danish Caribbean, but also up to North America and across the Atlantic to England, Germany, Denmark. They were all over the place. And the Moravian records, which have really only been examined by a small number of historians, are really astounding. So just to give you a sense of them, they give more detail about day-to-day life in the Protestant Caribbean than any other source that I've looked at. They're a little bit tricky because they're written mostly in an archaic form of German or in Dutch and Dutch Creole. So there are a lot of barriers to accessing the documents. But I really think that they're worth the effort because what they do is they provide a lot more insight into why enslaved and free people of color would have wanted to convert to Christianity. So, based on my research in the Moravian archives, I was able to gain some insight into the theological, social, and practical reasons that enslaved and free Black people decided to join the Moravian Church. And what I found is one thing that was crucial was sort of the desire for literacy. So especially early on in their missions, Moravian missionaries would teach enslaved and free Blacks to read and write. And what I saw is that enslaved and free Black people, they traveled extremely far distances and they risked serious violence from white colonists in order to come to Moravian meetings where they could learn how to be literate. The theological focus on sort of the suffering of Jesus in the Moravian missions was also really important. And I also found that families often converted together, which suggests that the church really became a way to solidify and support family and kin relationships. One other thing I want to mention about the Moravian records, and I could really go on and on about these records because they're so rich, but they also include some letters that are actually written by enslaved and free Black people themselves, which is extremely rare for the 18th century, for this early period of the 18th century. And I'll just mention one of them, which is particularly astounding and probably my favorite source from the research that I did. It's by a free African woman named Marata and addressed to the Queen of Denmark. And what you see is that it's actually written in two languages, Marata's West African native language, which is probably Fon, and then Dutch Creole on the other side, which was sort of the lingua franca of the Danish West Indies. And the letter itself is a plea for the Queen to intercede on behalf of Black Christian women like Marata, who are being literally beaten by white people for carrying Bibles and for attending worship meetings. And she writes about her own journey from Africa, where she was born and raised, to the West Indies, and the way that she chose to convert to Moravian Christianity. And it's an incredible and really heart-wrenching appeal that gives us a window into what Christian practice actually meant to at least some African converts. And this is a really rare and extremely important opportunity to tell this part of the story about the history of Christianity and slavery.
You know, when we started our conversation about Protestantism and its relationship with slavery, it started as a conversation about how Protestants used religion as a way to define who could be slave and who could be free. But now that we've looked at all these different missionary groups, we see that all these missionaries kind of debated using Christianity as a determinant of slavery. I mean, these groups really seem to question whether there might not be ways to Christianize slaves while also keeping them enslaved. Katharine, why do you think it's important for us to look at these shifts in Protestant thought in the Atlantic world? How exactly does a better understanding of these debates and shifts in Protestant thought help us better understand early American history?
Well, I think there are a lot of important stories here. So I think first, what we see sort of as the conversation about Christianity and slavery unfolds is that, number one, missionaries' efforts to promote slave conversion actually kind of ironically end up creating the foundation for what would eventually become pro-slavery theology. So missionaries, as I explained earlier, because they encountered a great deal of resistance from slave owners who didn't want enslaved people to become Christian, they end up trying to convince slave owners that Christian slaves would be more loyal and harder working. Basically, that conversion could be a form of slave control. And I don't think that this is actually how Christianity functions, but it was a really powerful argument. And we see versions of it becoming the core defense of slavery in the 19th century. So I think it's really important to recognize that as one legacy of the story. But it's not the only story about Christianity and slavery. And so I think it's also important to hold that intention with the role that Christianity played for enslaved and free people who chose to convert to Christianity. Many of them challenged missionary and white interpretations of Christianity. And, the Moravian records contain numerous examples of disagreements about different aspects of Christian theology between enslaved and free converts and white missionaries. For example, what does it mean to turn the other cheek in the context of slavery? What is a true Christian? When should someone be baptized? These were live debates that were happening in mission churches and slave societies. And so what we see here is that another type of Protestantism is developing within these sort of majority or all Black congregations. So that is sort of a second, I think, big takeaway from this history. And then finally, I'll say, I think that the other thing that this history shows us is how important religion is for understanding the history of race, and specifically the history of whiteness. So, as I said before, whiteness literally replaced the word Christian in colonial law books in many cases. And lawmakers did this for very specific political and economic reasons. So I think that if we want to understand the history of race and racism and the history of white supremacy, we have to actually look at this history of Christian slavery and the history of Protestant supremacy in order to understand that longer history of race and racism.
Now let's jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the English, Dutch, and Danish had required baptism for enslaved people as the Spanish, Portuguese, and French colonies did? How would the relationship between Protestantism and slavery have evolved differently?
So this is a really interesting question to think about. For me, the answer really has to do with two things: enforcements and the definition of conversion. So English, Danish, and Dutch imperial officials, actually, they often said that slaves should be baptized, but they didn't actually have the power to enforce this. And slave owners were basically given free rein to do as they wanted in the early colonial period. So we would have to imagine a Protestant church that was more powerful and centralized, that then would have maybe been able to better enforce baptismal policies. And in this case, I actually don't think you would see the development of Protestant supremacy. Probably as a result, you might see a more rapid transition to race-based slavery law, but also a slightly different racial formation develop in the Protestant colonies than the one that actually developed. The second thing that I think about has to do with the definition of conversion, right? So if baptism was required, then a major question would be, what are the prerequisites for baptism? Does an enslaved person need to, for example, be able to read the Bible? Do they need to have a conversion narrative? Because these were requirements for many Protestant denominations. And so I think that if baptism were mandatory, you would maybe see a change in how Protestant conversion was actually theorized. And this, I think, would have caused massive controversy. There's already massive controversy about defining Protestant conversion. So it's hard to think through all of the possible scenarios, but I definitely think it would have changed the contours of Protestant theology as we know it today.
So, Katharine, what's next for you? Now that you've explored the relationship between Christianity and slavery in the early modern Atlantic world, what are you researching now?
I'm working on a couple projects right now. One is called Constructing Religion Defining Crime, and it's about the criminalization of Black religious practices under slavery. And I'm really interested in the ways in which the boundaries of religion shifted due to social systems like slavery, and the impact that that history has on our ideas about religious freedom, for example. And I'm also sort of continuing to work through the Moravian sources, this time on the island of Jamaica, and doing sort of a microhistory of slavery and Christianity there. And I'm especially interested in thinking more about how we can sort of re-theorize the Caribbean as a place where really important theological and intellectual debates were happening. And so that's sort of another area that I'm working on right now.
Christian slavery is a really rich work, and we've really just scratched the surface of it. So how can we connect with you to ask you more questions?
The best way would be to email me at kgerbner@umn.edu, but I also have a website where I sort of describe not just an outline of Christian slavery, the book, but also I describe what I've been working on since I finished the book. The website is katharinegerbner.com, spelled KATHARINEGERBNER.com. I also occasionally tweet. My handle is @KTGerbs, so KTGERBS. And I have some more information sort of about my teaching on the University of Minnesota webpage.
Katharine Gerbner, thank you for joining us, and thank you for helping us explore the relationship and ideas between Christianity and slavery.
Thank you so much for having me.
Christianity and slavery have a very long and complicated history. It's a history that sees Christians in Europe and the Americas using Christianity to justify their enslavement of non-Christian peoples, particularly of African and African-descended peoples. Of course, the ways Christians use Christianity to justify slavery changed over time. As Katharine noted, we first see Protestants adapting Catholic ideas about slavery to suit their own religious views. Whereas Catholics looked upon Catholicism as being compatible with the idea of Christianizing slaves, early Protestants didn't. Early Protestants believed that to be Protestant was to be free, something that slaves were just not. And this is why we see laws and customs develop in colonies like Barbados that excluded slaves from free society by using the word Christian. If you weren't a Christian, then you just couldn't participate in free society. However, the colonists' association of Protestantism with freedom changed over time. By the late 17th century, historical sources reveal that instead of using the word Christian to exclude slaves from free society, they began using the word white. But why the shift in terminology? As Katharine revealed, it's because Protestant missionaries pushed for a change in the relationship between Christianity and slavery. Missionaries wanted Christian slaveholders to convert their slaves to Christianity, and they argued that slaveholders' evangelizing efforts would be rewarded in the form of more obedient and trustworthy slaves. But if you convert slaves to Protestantism, how can they still be slaves? This logic is part of what compelled slaveholding Americans to shift their justifications for slavery from religious-based views to race-based views. And being able to see and chart this shift is really important, because as Katharine noted, this shift shows us how important religion has been to ideas about race, and how it was possible for race-based justifications for slavery to emerge. If we really want to understand race and racism today, then we really need to understand earlier notions of Christian slavery. Look for more information about Katharine, her book, Christian Slavery, plus notes for what we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/206. If you've ever wanted to learn a new language or improve your knowledge of a language you learned long ago, you should try out Babbel. In fact, you can try Babbel for free. Just go to babbel.com or download the app from your favorite app store and try it for free. Again, that's Babbel, BABBEL.com, or download their app and try it for free. Babbel.com. Here behind the scenes, Holly White helped me produce this episode. Thank you for your help, Holly. Finally, I find comparative history to be really fascinating, and I'm curious, what colonies or areas of history would you like to read or hear more comparisons made about? Personally, I'd still really love to read, or possibly even research, a history that compares the Dutch Revolt to the American Revolution. This was the original topic I wanted to research in grad school, and although my advisor turned me on to a different fun topic, I still really want to know how ideas from this earlier war for independence and Republican government influenced the American struggle to achieve independence and build a new government. I mean, we know ideas crisscross the Atlantic world, so I really want to see how this particular crisscrossing played out. What about you? What colonies or areas of history would you like to see compared? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.